There is a kind of heart that does not simply feel, it absorbs. It listens to pain before it is spoken, it notices sorrow before it is shown, and it carries the weight of others as though it were its own. We call this heart a super empath. But even the most tender soul has a breaking point, not from cruelty alone, but from a single emotional mistake, trusting too deeply in those who only know how to take. And when that mistake is made, it does not leave loudly. It changes everything quietly, like a door closing in the spirit that can never quite be opened the same way again. There are souls who walk into a room and feel its temperature before they ever hear a word spoken. A super empath is one of those souls. They do not simply observe life, they absorb it, like soil taking in rain it did not ask for, but cannot refuse. Every glance carries meaning, every silence carries weight, and every emotion in another person finds a hidden echo within their own heart. This is not a weakness dressed as sensitivity, but a rare kind of awareness that sees beyond the surface of things into the trembling truth that most people hide even from themselves. To feel this deeply is to live with doors inside the heart that never fully close. Joy does not pass through without leaving warmth, and sorrow does not arrive without leaving a mark. A super empath learns early that emotions are not separate events. They are shared weather systems. When someone they love is hurting, they do not stand beside the pain, they step into it. And in doing so, they often forget where the other person ends and where they begin. This is the hidden strength and the hidden risk, to love without walls in a world that often builds them too late. And yet there is a beauty in this depth that cannot be imitated. A super empath notices what others miss, the tremor in a voice that pretends to be steady, the tiredness behind a practiced smile, the silent plea hidden in a casual conversation. They become translators of the unspoken world, carrying understanding where others carry judgment. But this gift, when unguarded, becomes a doorway through which too many emotions enter and too few boundaries remain. Over time, they may find themselves carrying burdens that were never meant to be theirs, believing that love means endurance without limits. Still, even the most sensitive heart is not meant to remain unprotected. There comes a quiet awakening in the life of every super empath, a moment when they begin to realize that depth without direction can become drowning. They start to understand that feeling everything does not mean accepting everything, and that compassion without self-respect slowly turns inward into exhaustion. In that realization, something sacred begins to form, not a closing of the heart, but a strengthening of it. They learn that their sensitivity was never the problem. It was the absence of boundaries that allowed it to be wounded so deeply. And so, the super empath begins again, not less feeling, but more aware. They carry their depth like a lantern instead of an open wound, choosing carefully where to place their light. And in doing so, they discover that their greatest strength was never just how deeply they could feel, but how wisely they could finally choose what to carry and what to leave behind. There is a line that does not appear on any map of the human heart, yet every super empath eventually stands before it. It is the quiet border between compassion and self-betrayal. At first it looks harmless, almost noble, to care deeply, to give freely, to understand without conditions. It feels like love in its purest form. But over time, what begins as kindness can slowly turn into something heavier, something that asks the giver to disappear piece by piece in order to keep someone else whole. A super empath does not set out to lose themselves. They begin by listening more than speaking, understanding more than being understood, and giving more than they receive. They believe, often with pure intention, that love can heal everything if it is strong enough, patient enough, forgiving enough. And so they forgive what should have been questioned, they excuse what should have been addressed, and they stay where their silence becomes a form of survival rather than peace. In that space, compassion begins to stretch beyond its natural shape. There is a moment, subtle and almost unnoticeable, when giving stops being joyful and starts becoming obligatory. The heart still says yes, but something inside grows tired of saying it without rest. The super empath begins to mistake endurance for love and sacrifice for loyalty. They hold space for others so consistently that there is no space left for themselves. And yet they continue because their nature resists abandonment, even of situations that abandon them emotionally every day. The dangerous part is not kindness itself, but the belief that kindness must never have limits. When boundaries are absent, compassion becomes an open door through which other people's needs, emotions, and expectations walk in freely, often without invitation. The super empath becomes a quiet refuge for others, while slowly becoming homeless within their own inner world. They start to feel exhausted but call it care. They start to feel unseen but call it patience. They start to feel drained but call it love. And then, one day, something shifts. Not loudly, but with a kind of emotional clarity that cannot be ignored. The heart that once expanded endlessly begins to ask a question it avoided for too long. At what cost? Not in anger, but in recognition. Because even the deepest compassion was never meant to erase the one who carries it. Even love, in its truest form, was never meant to require self-erasure as proof. In that realization, the super empath does not become less loving. They become more truthful. They begin to understand that self-betrayal can never be the foundation of genuine compassion. That giving, when it destroys the giver, is no longer love, but imbalance disguised as virtue. And slowly, they start to step back, not from care itself, but from the places where care demanded their disappearance. And in that space, they reclaim something they had almost forgotten, the right to exist fully without having to suffer in silence to prove their worth. There is a kind of silence that follows a betrayal so subtle it does not look like betrayal at first. It arrives wrapped in familiarity, in trust, in the soft belief that love given will be met with the same honesty it was born from. For a super empath, this is where the deepest wound is often created, not in obvious cruelty, but in the quiet imbalance of giving too much to someone who only knew how to receive. The one emotional mistake they never forget is not simply being hurt. It is the realization that their depth of feeling was seen, recognized, and still used without care. It is the moment they understand that their loyalty was not matched with the same intention, that their emotional honesty became a place where someone else could rest without ever learning to hold them in return. This kind of pain does not explode, it settles. It becomes a memory that does not fade, only softens around the edges with time. A super empath does not love lightly. When they choose someone, they choose with their whole inner world. They notice the smallest needs, the unspoken fears, the hidden wounds, and they respond as though healing is their responsibility. But when that same openness is met with convenience instead of respect, something inside them begins to fracture quietly. They continue giving because their nature does not easily recognize withdrawal as protection. Instead, they interpret distance as something they must fix, something they must understand more deeply. And so they stay longer than they should, not because they are blind, but because they are faithful to the idea of what love could be. They believe that if they just try a little more, understand a little deeper, forgive a little easier, things will return to balance. But emotional imbalance does not correct itself through sacrifice. It deepens when one person becomes the constant giver and the other becomes the silent taker. The forgetting comes later, but the remembering never fully leaves. Even when they walk away, even when they rebuild their life with stronger boundaries and quieter expectations, there is a place inside them that recalls the exact moment they realized their love was not being held with the same care they offered it. It is not bitterness that lives there, but awareness, a permanent shift in how they see emotional honesty, a quiet understanding that not everyone who receives love knows how to respect it. And yet, even this mistake becomes a kind of teacher. It does not destroy their ability to love, but it reshapes it. They begin to see that genuine love is never proven through self-abandonment, that loyalty is not measured by how much one can endure in silence, and that being emotionally used does not define their worth, but reveals where their boundaries were not yet strong enough to protect what was sacred within them. In time, the super empath learns that what they cannot forget is not meant to imprison them, but to refine them. And in that refinement, they begin to love again, not less deeply, but more wisely, with eyes that still feel everything, but a heart that no longer agrees to disappear in the process. There is a pattern that repeats itself in the quiet corners of human connection, where emotional manipulators often find their way toward those who feel the deepest. A super empath does not attract them by weakness, but by light. There is something unmistakable about a heart that responds quickly to pain, that listens without judgment, and that tries to understand even what hurts it. To someone who is skilled in emotional control, this kind of openness appears not as beauty, but as opportunity. Emotional manipulators rarely present themselves in obvious forms. They often arrive with charm that feels familiar, with attention that feels intense, and with stories that awaken the natural compassion of a super empath. At first, it feels like being seen in a way that is rare and almost healing. The empath feels understood, perhaps even valued, for their depth in a world that often misunderstands them. But what begins as recognition slowly shifts into something more calculated, where affection is used as a tool rather than a truth. A super empath, by nature, tries to understand before they judge. They search for reasons behind behavior, for wounds behind actions, for meaning behind silence. This instinct, which is a form of emotional intelligence, becomes the very path through which manipulation enters. Because where others may see inconsistency as a warning, the empath often sees it as something to heal. Where others may step back, the empath leans in closer, believing that patience can repair what confusion creates. The manipulator learns this quickly. They learn that inconsistency can be excused, that emotional withdrawal can be forgiven, and that responsibility can be shifted without resistance. They test boundaries not all at once, but slowly, in ways that feel almost invisible. A small disregard here, a subtle guilt there, an emotional reversal that makes the empath question their own perception. Over time, the empath begins to doubt not their feelings, but their interpretation of them. What makes this dynamic so complex is that the empath does not stay because they are trapped, but because they are hopeful. They believe that understanding deeper will eventually lead to change. They invest emotionally in potential, not in pattern. And in that investment, they often give more than they receive, hoping that balance will eventually return if they just remain patient enough. But emotional manipulation does not seek balance. It thrives in imbalance. It grows stronger when one person consistently questions themselves while the other remains unaccountable. The empath begins to carry emotional responsibility for two people, believing that if something is wrong, it must be because they have not yet done enough to fix it. And yet, even within this experience, something begins to awaken. There comes a moment when the super empath starts to notice that understanding someone else has come at the cost of misunderstanding themselves. That compassion, when not reciprocated with respect, becomes a one-sided offering that slowly drains the very heart that gives it. In that realization, the pattern begins to lose its power. Not because the empath stops caring, but because they finally begin to include themselves in the circle of care they have always extended to others. There is a kind of pain that does not announce itself, it does not scream, it does not demand attention, and it does not always show itself in visible tears. For a super empath, this pain often learns how to live quietly behind the face they show to the world. Outwardly, they may appear composed, even understanding, sometimes the one who comforts others, the one who listens, the one who seems to hold everything together. But inwardly, there are moments when silence becomes heavier than words ever could. This silent pain is not born from a single event. It is built slowly through small emotional accumulations that are too often dismissed or internalized. A moment of being misunderstood, a feeling of not being fully valued, a pattern of giving that is not fully returned. These do not always create immediate reaction. Instead, they settle into the heart like layers of unspoken emotion. And because the super empath is naturally inclined to understand others, they often delay understanding themselves. They smile, not because everything is fine, but because they have learned how to function while carrying emotional weight. That smile becomes a kind of language the world understands more easily than their truth. It says, I am okay, even when parts of them are quietly exhausted. It becomes a mask that is not worn out of deception, but out of habit, out of care for others, out of the belief that their own pain should not interrupt the lives around them. Inside, however, there are conversations that never reach the outside world, questions that are never spoken aloud. Why does it feel like I am always the one who understands, but rarely the one who is understood? Why do I keep giving pieces of myself and still feel unseen? These thoughts do not always arrive in dramatic moments. Sometimes they come in the middle of ordinary silence, when everything appears still, but the heart is not. The super empath often becomes skilled at managing this internal contrast. They continue to show up, continue to support, continue to offer emotional presence, even when their own presence feels stretched thin. But over time, carrying pain in silence creates a distance within themselves. Not from others first, but from their own emotional truth. They begin to adapt to functioning while disconnected from what they are actually feeling. And yet, even this silence is not empty. It is filled with unspoken understanding, with lessons forming slowly beneath the surface. There comes a point where the weight becomes noticeable enough that it can no longer be ignored as just part of life. The inner world starts asking for attention in ways that cannot be dismissed forever, not through chaos, but through clarity that quietly insists something must change. In that space, the super empath begins to recognize that smiling through pain does not erase it. It only delays the moment it must be faced, and facing it does not mean becoming less strong, but becoming more honest with the self that has been carrying too much alone for too long. There is a moment in the life of a super empath that does not arrive with noise or drama. It does not break the door open or announce itself with certainty. Instead, it comes quietly, almost like a thought that refuses to leave, repeating itself until it can no longer be ignored. It often begins after a long stretch of emotional exhaustion, when giving has continued far beyond what the heart can naturally replenish, and silence has become more honest than conversation. At first, nothing seems different on the outside. The super empath still responds, still listens, still understands. But something subtle begins to shift within. The reactions that once came automatically now pause for a fraction longer. The emotional reflex to fix, to save, to explain everything for others begins to slow. Not because the heart has turned cold, but because it has grown tired of running toward places where it is never fully met. This awakening is not a rejection of love. It is a recognition of imbalance. The super empath starts to see patterns that were once softened by hope. The repeated cycles of giving without return, of understanding without being understood, of staying without being held in the same emotional space. And in that seeing, something uncomfortable but necessary begins to form, clarity without illusion. It is not a sudden decision. It is a gradual unfolding, like light entering a room that has long been dim. The super empath begins to notice how often they have explained away their own discomfort for the sake of keeping peace, how often they have called emotional neglect patience and called self-abandonment love. These realizations do not come with anger at first. They come with silence because the mind is still trying to understand what the heart has already started to accept. And then there is a turning point that cannot be undone. A moment where the super empath realizes that they have been present in everyone else's emotional world, but absent in their own, that they have carried the weight of understanding others so deeply that they forgot to ask whether they were being understood at all. This is where awakening becomes irreversible, not loud, but final in its quiet truth. Something inside begins to reorient. The need to over-explain fades. The urgency to fix everything softens. The emotional responsibility that was never theirs starts to feel less like duty and more like depletion. And for the first time, they begin to consider a question that had always been pushed aside. What happens if I choose myself at the same level I have chosen others? This is not a moment of closure. It is a moment of opening. But the opening is inward, toward the self that has been waiting beneath years of emotional overextension. There is grief in it, because awareness always comes with loss. The loss of old patterns, the loss of illusions, the loss of versions of love that required silence from the self. And yet, within that grief, there is also something steady forming, a kind of quiet strength that does not need to prove itself through endurance anymore. The super empath does not become less feeling in this moment. They become more anchored in their feeling, no longer allowing it to erase their boundaries. The awakening is not the end of their depth, but the beginning of its direction. There are wounds that time cannot measure in the usual way, because they are not only remembered by the mind, but felt again by the heart whenever something familiar passes by. For a super empath, betrayal is not just an event that happens between two people. It is an emotional rupture in the way they understand connection itself. It cuts deeper, not because they are fragile, but because they enter relationships with a level of honesty that expects honesty in return. When a super empath loves, they do not calculate emotional risk. They do not hold parts of themselves back as protection. Instead, they step into connection with sincerity that is almost complete in its openness. They listen without preparing a response. They understand without demanding explanation, and they give without quietly keeping score. This way of loving is not strategic. It is instinctive. It comes from a place that believes emotional truth should be enough to sustain emotional safety. But betrayal disrupts that belief in a way that feels disorienting. It is not only the loss of trust in another person, but the sudden collapse of an inner assumption that love is naturally reciprocal when it is genuine. For a super empath, this realization does not arrive as anger first. It arrives as confusion. The mind tries to understand what went wrong in a system they believed was based on sincerity. They replay moments, conversations, silences, searching for the point where honesty was not enough. What makes this pain deeper is that they often see the betrayal long before they are ready to accept it. Their sensitivity picks up on emotional inconsistencies, on changes in tone, on distance that is not spoken but felt. Yet instead of withdrawing immediately, they tend to explain it, to soften it, to give it meaning that preserves connection. They assume misunderstanding before they assume intention. This delay between perception and acceptance creates an emotional gap where hope continues to live even when truth has already started to shift. When betrayal finally becomes undeniable, It does not just end a relationship, it changes the way the super empath relates to emotional reality. They begin to question not only the other person, but their own openness, not in a way that turns them cold, but in a way that makes them more careful with where they place their emotional honesty. Because they understand, sometimes painfully, that not every heart interprets sincerity with the same depth it is given. And yet, even in this depth of hurt, something important survives. The super empath does not lose their capacity to love honestly. What changes is the direction of that honesty. It begins to include themselves. They start to recognize that love without awareness can become self-exposure, and trust without boundaries can become emotional vulnerability without protection. Over time, betrayal becomes less of an open wound and more of a turning point. Not something they forget, but something they learn from. It teaches them that emotional truth is powerful, but it must be met with equal respect to remain safe. And in that understanding, they do not become less open-hearted. They become more discerning, carrying their honesty forward, not as something to give away blindly, but as something to offer where it is recognized, valued, and held with care. There is a quiet turning point in the life of a super empath when giving no longer feels like love in its purest form, but like a quiet disappearance of the self. It does not happen all at once. It begins in small ways that are easy to overlook. A moment of exhaustion that is ignored, a need that is postponed, a boundary that is softened for the sake of keeping peace. Over time, these small choices begin to shape a pattern where the self is always slightly secondary, always slightly delayed, always slightly less important than the emotional needs of others. At first, overgiving feels meaningful. It feels like strength, like devotion, like emotional generosity that defines who they are. A super empath often believes that the more they understand, the more they give, and the more they endure, the more valuable their love becomes. There is a silent pride in being the one who stays, who listens, who absorbs what others cannot hold. But slowly, that pride begins to feel heavier than peace. What once felt like purpose starts to feel like pressure. The shift begins when exhaustion is no longer temporary, when the heart no longer recovers as quickly as it used to, when emotional availability becomes something they have to force rather than something that flows naturally. In that space, the super empath starts to notice something unfamiliar: resentment without anger, tiredness without explanation, silence that feels less like calm and more like distance from themselves. Self-respect does not arrive as a loud decision. It arrives as awareness, a realization that constantly extending oneself without limit is not the same as love, it is depletion. And in that realization, boundaries begin to appear not as walls built to shut others out, but as lines drawn to prevent the self from being erased. At first, these boundaries feel uncomfortable. Saying no feels unfamiliar. Choosing rest feels undeserved. Prioritizing emotional safety feels almost selfish to a heart that has been conditioned to prioritize everyone else. But with time, something begins to change. The super empath starts to understand that boundaries are not rejection of others, they are recognition of self. They are the quiet acknowledgement that emotional capacity is not infinite, and that love without balance eventually turns into emotional neglect of the self. In this understanding, boundaries stop feeling like limitations and start feeling like protection. There is also grief in this transformation, the grief of realizing how long they existed in a pattern of overgiving without awareness, the grief of recognizing how often their kindness was assumed rather than appreciated. But this grief does not break them, it refines them. It teaches them that self-respect is not the opposite of love, but the foundation that makes healthy love possible. And so the super empath begins to change in ways that are not loud but deeply permanent. They still feel deeply, still care deeply, still understand others in ways few can, but now they include themselves in that same circle of care. They begin to pause before giving, to listen to their own emotional state before responding to others, to recognize that their presence has value even when it is not being offered constantly. In this transformation, they learn something that was always true but rarely practiced, that love does not require self-erasure to be real, and that the most meaningful kind of giving is the one that does not cost the giver their own peace. There is a moment in the journey of a super empath when walking away is no longer an emotional reaction, but a quiet act of clarity. It does not begin with anger, and it does not end with relief. It begins with exhaustion so deep that staying feels heavier than leaving. And in that heaviness, something within them starts to understand that love, without balance, is no longer love that can sustain the self. When a super empath walks away, it rarely looks dramatic on the outside. There are no loud declarations, no need for revenge, no desire to prove a point. What appears instead is silence, but it is not empty silence. It is a silence filled with everything they once gave away in words, in patience, in emotional availability, and in understanding that was not always returned. That silence carries memory, but it no longer carries permission for harm. For others, this silence can feel confusing at first. They may expect explanation, confrontation, or emotional engagement that once came so easily. But what they encounter instead is distance, not coldness, but completion. The super empath has already processed what needed to be understood. They have already replayed the patterns, recognized the imbalance, and accepted what their heart had been trying to communicate long before their voice ever stopped speaking. This is where their silence becomes stronger than any argument, because arguments require energy, and energy requires emotional investment. The super empath no longer invests in spaces where their truth was repeatedly questioned or where their presence was taken for granted. Their absence becomes a language of its own, one that does not seek to convince, but simply to exist outside of what once drained them. And in that absence, something powerful shifts. The super empath is no longer available to cycles that depended on their over-explaining or over-giving. They no longer rush to repair misunderstandings that were never truly addressed with honesty. Instead, they allow space for reality to speak without their interference. And often, what is left behind is the echo of what was once unbalanced finally becoming visible. Walking away is not an attempt to erase the past. It is an acceptance that presence without respect eventually erodes the self. The super empath begins to understand that their value was never dependent on how much they could endure or how much they could forgive. Their value exists independently of what they tolerated. And in that understanding, silence becomes not absence, but restoration. There is also a transformation that happens within this silence. At first, it feels unfamiliar, almost too still, but slowly it becomes grounding. The absence of constant emotional output creates space where the self can return. Thoughts become clearer. Emotions become their own again, no longer constantly shaped by external demands. And in that clarity, the super empath begins to reconnect with parts of themselves that were once overshadowed by overextension. What once felt like loss begins to feel like recovery. What once felt like emptiness begins to feel like space. And what once felt like walking away begins to feel like walking back toward themselves. Not away from love, but away from imbalance. Not away from connection, but away from the cost of losing themselves inside it. And so their silence remains, not as punishment, not as distance, but as proof that they finally chose a place where their presence no longer requires self-sacrifice to exist.